Hello and welcome to the Ireland on the Fly podcast about the people and places of fly fishing in Ireland. This season we've heard about the disastrous spring salmon run, and there hasn't been much to report yet for the grilse run. All in all, our worst fears about salmon numbers seem to be coming true, and not just in Ireland. One of the worst culprits, of course, is aquaculture and the effects that sea lice from salmon farms has on migrating salmon, which the industry and the government, via the state body the Marine Institute, try to lessen somewhat by quoting from a dubious scientific paper. However, the hugely respected fishery scientist Paddy Gargan has led and released what's been called a landmark study, which shows that, contrary to the Marine Institute and salmon farming stance, sea lice does have a major and significant effect on the mortality of salmon. This paper has just been released and its implications will be far-reaching, and we'll be hearing from Paddy shortly on it. Plus, staying with salmon, we also speak to John Murphy from Salmon Watch Ireland, a regular contributor to this show. John is back from last week's NASCO conference, where the stark reality about the future of wild Atlantic salmon was laid bare. First, Tom, it all made for some sobering discussions.
Yeah, Dara, it really does, and all the listeners, you'll hear them now later. I mean, it's interesting. Like when we're doing this podcast, we try and get a nice mix between trout and salmon. And, it's unfortunate, but this year and last year, it's a lot of what we do in the salmon is not great news. Constantly hearing of poor runs, poor catches, other countries closing their rivers. It's sobering's a very good word there.
I think Conor Arnold is the man who calls it as it is. His phrase last year, falling off a cliff, just keeps ringing in my ears. We spoke to him again this year, and he was in contact about those fish that were appearing in May. Remember, he said, they might be just a delayed spring run, or what are they? And then he said, no, they were May fish, which meant there was no spring run. Yeah. So you don't want to be going on doom and gloom all the time about it, but at the same time...
we can't ignore it either, Tara. We just can't ignore it. They're the facts.
And isn't it terrible, though, as well, at the same time, any kind of salmon stuff we're covering ends up becoming conservation stuff. Yeah. And I was actually thinking about it today, it was, if you're a salmon angler now, because salmon fishing has gotten so difficult and so endangered, you're actually now more a salmon conservationist first almost, and a salmon angler second. Yeah. Because by choice of your hobby, that's now what it has become. Yeah. And I found that really interesting kind of when I was thinking about that today, going, actually, anybody who's any interest in salmon angling is actually now should be a salmon conservationist. Should be a salmon,
or, and that's not everybody's cup of tea, should we say.
No,
and that's
exactly.
why, and John mentions it about that, the waning interest in salmon fishing.
I would say I'm sorry for depressing people on this, but it's, you can't bury your head in the sand. You have to be aware of what's going on. I think it's really interesting, John, talking about the stressors report from the NASCO conference, where all the countries basically put together a list of what the main problems were. And John goes through the results. But the big one for everyone in the North Atlantic is the changing oceans. Temperature, which nobody has a clue about, or how to control, or how to stop, or how to mitigate. So that's the most worrying thing. So salmon anglers, unfortunately, having to become salmon conservationists, and that's why we do episodes like this, so people are aware of what's going on. And also, and the other big problem is aquaculture, salmon farms, which Paddy Gargan's paper, like, fair play to him. My God, this is a landmark study that he's been involved in, and surely
very interesting, wasn't it? It was really interesting to hear about it. And I would suggest to anybody to get a chance to have a look at it and see what was done, and how the research was done, and how they compiled the results of it. It's
20 years of data, so it's incontrovertible, in fairness. Yeah. So it's hopefully another nail in the coffin of salmon farming, but it gets harder and harder for politicians to ignore when you have this growing scientific evidence that is stronger and stronger and growing.
The elephant in the room, so it is.
That we all know about, except the people that matter. So hopefully this is something that they won't be able to ignore. And in fairness, talking to John Murphy, when he tells us about the court cases that are won, that sometimes you have to go all the way to the courts, the High Court, and get a judicial ruling on it, because they will actually listen to the stats and the figures.
Yeah, in fact, and I was saying to you afterwards, or after the tours, that was about the only bit of, sort of good news that we had,
Although I was saying it might take so long to get to the courts, it could be too late. Like,
Yeah.
And look, really interesting interviews to hear. So let's get back to, we'll hear from John Murphy from Salmon Watch Ireland, but first let's hear from Paddy Gargan on that landmark study that he led.
The background really is that we knew for a long time that sea trout in aquaculture bays in the West were suffering from the infestation from sea lice from salmon farms. While many of them died at sea from the lice, a lot of them came back into fresh water to try and rid themselves of the lice. And we've sampled thousands of sea trout in rivers in the West and shown that they have lice levels that would cause mortality. But the problem we had was that the salmon smolts, when they go out, their migratory urge is so strong to go to the high seas that they never come back. And it was difficult then to determine where sea lice from salmon farms impacting on salmon as well as sea trout, because we weren't seeing them coming back. So we decided it was in 2001, over 20 years ago, that we would take batches of salmon smolts and we would treat half of them with a chemical in the feed that protects them against lice infestation, and we wouldn't treat the other half. And we would release them, and we would see whether, when they come back a year later, were there less of the untreated fish coming back. And the suggestion there is that the fish that had no treatment against sea lice would suffer greater mortality in certain bays in certain years going out, and that would be proof that sea lice from aquaculture were impacting salmon as well as sea trout. So we did those experiments for 20 years, and certainly we found that there was a big reduction, and we found about an 18% less return of the fish with no chemical treatment.
18%. Wow.
That's huge.
That was on average. I mean, sometimes it would be a lot higher. Sometimes there would be very little difference because the lice levels would be low in the bay. So on average, it was 18%. Yeah.
This is the most significant study that has been done that has shown this, hasn't it, Paddy?
Yes, there have been other studies. We published a study in 2012 that showed a significant effect as well. And I was involved with some Norwegian studies that are all showing the same thing. Generally, you find results of these experiments somewhere between 12 and 40 or 50% are the results that come out from different experiments. But varying levels, depending on how much lice they're exposed to and the conditions, the size of the bays and all of that. But yeah, so there have been these experiments done in Ireland and Norway. We published one in 2012 that showed a significant effect. And then there was another one published in 2014, which also found an effect, but didn't. It determined that the impact was minor. Even though it was a significant effect of lice on salmon, it determined that the effect was minor.
I'm going to come back to that study in a minute, because obviously there's a huge contrast in terms of what your 2012 paper was studying and now more especially what this latest study is showing, because I think there's huge implications for this. Is that 18% conservative, do you think?
Yes, it is, because what's happened in the last 10 years is that the sea lice have developed resistance to the chemical, and we say in our new paper that the effect of lice is greater than we have shown in the data, because when you think you've treated half your fish with a chemical that stops the lice developing on them, in fact, many of those fish don't have the protection because the lice have developed resistance. So we do say that the effect is greater than we have shown, simply because over the decades, the lice have built resistance. So you find that these experiments aren't being done anymore, simply because the results are you're not getting the true effect because of the resistance.
And the thing about this as well is this was specifically salmon, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. All these experiments use hatchery salmon because it's almost impossible to catch wild salmon smolts migrating and tag them and treat half. It has been done in Norway, but it's very difficult to do it with wild smolts. So the assumption here is that if you can show an impact over many years with less salmon smolts returning as adults the following year when lice levels are high, that the same implication uh, will apply for wild smolts migrating in those estuaries.
For people who might naysayers or also known as salmon farm enthusiasts, could they say, "Oh, well, that was hatchery reared salmon, so therefore it's not the same"? Is there any kind of
Yeah.
I don't think so, because salmon smolts need to migrate out through bays in the spring, and they're released, or our fish are released at the same time, late April and May, when the wild smolts are going to sea. And they migrate out and they pick up lice like the wild smolts. And in bad lice year, or in the second year of production, when there's more lice around, 12 lice will kill a salmon smolt going out. So the hatchery fish are exposed similarly to lice, clouds of lice or infestations of lice, the same as wild fish. And they're migrating out to sea like the wild fish in the same aquaculture bays. And it's generally accepted, and I've worked on quite a few different projects in Norway and Ireland on this subject. The term is that the experiments are used as a proxy. We use hatchery smolts as a proxy for estimating the effect on wild fish.
it would seem that it's incontrovertible in terms of what your study has shown and the data has shown. It's 20 years plus. But we do know that salmon farm applications in this country have been used in support by the Marine Institute based on this Jackson paper from 2014, which downplayed the significance of the mortality of sea lice on salmon. So surely this new paper will supersede that one.
Yeah, well, I would hope that people will take a much more, serious look at the effect. I mean, any new application or renewal needs to have an environmental impact assessment, and needs to consider all the available literature. So this, I think, will be a significant, addition to the literature on the subject. And we would have to say that all these studies find similar results. The Irish studies, my own earlier ones, and the Marine Institute published ones, found similar results. Maybe not at the same level, but they're all finding that lice are can be a significant impact on salmon smolt survival. So this one, having a lot of data, reviewed all of the published and unpublished results that we have in Ireland, certainly takes it further. In this study, we looked at the level of lice on the farms and the number of fish, which hadn't been done before. And the results show that if you have higher lice infestation while in the spring, your returns will be of untreated fish will be lower. So this one took it a stage further and said, the higher the lice level, the greater the impact on salmon mortality there'll be. So you certainly would hope that regulators and would seriously consider the effect, the implications of this study.
A couple of things there I want to ask you, Paddy. But first of all, the 2014 report, it did say that there was an effect, but it was very much a play with figures, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, it did. It did find that the results suggest that while sea lice-induced mortality on out-migrating smolts can be significant, it was minor and irregular. And really, what that was suggesting was that when salmon go to sea, only 5% return in general, and their study suggested that was reduced to 4% because of the sea lice effect, and their paper suggested that was only a 1% loss of mortality. And in fact, I would suggest that when you have 5% reduced to 4% of the fish that survive to come back, that's a 20% loss.
Yeah, that's in Animal's terms, that's a 20% of the total coming back. It's a 20% drop. Yeah. And interesting there. And then what I want to ask you, Paddy, you mentioned when there's, should we say, an increase in lice levels. How does this happen, or how do we know about it?
In the salmon farming industry, there's a 2-year cycle where the young smolts are taken from fresh water. Sometimes they're put in November or in the spring in March, and they generally don't have a lot of lice in the first spring when they're in the water, because they're small and they do pick up lice from the wild, and then they accumulate them. But it's generally in their second year in the sea, in the spring, in the second year, when there may be 3 or 4 kilos, that they're much bigger. They've been at sea for a lot longer. They have a lot higher lice level. So it's generally it's a situation where in their second year at sea is when you have a potentially a more serious lice problem.
Like, how do we know then that there's a greater number of lice from one year to the
Well,
next?
there's Marine Institute would sample the fish on the salmon farms twice a month in March, April, and May. So they actually publish for a long time. They publish the lice levels on all the salmon farms, and the Department of Agriculture provide estimates of the stock density of salmon on the farm. So by using those two, the lice level and the number of salmon on the farm, you can get a rough estimate of the amount of lice present
Right.
at a time when these experiments are going ahead. And as I said earlier, we found that the higher the lice, the estimated lice level, the greater the impact there will be.
Actually, so just on that, the stocking of the salmon. So you said the estimate of the salmon stocking, the density. Who provides the figures on the salmon stocking?
Well, the Department of Agriculture have inspectors who look at cages and look at all the various conditions where cages are at sea, and the various conditions that are in their license, and they also estimate. They get information from each farmer as to the number of stock on the farm at the time of the inspection.
So it's the farm that does provide the numbers.
Yeah, but they have a certain level of tonnage in their license. They're different farms have a different level of production tonnage they're licensed to produce, and so it's not that everybody can put as many fish out as they want, and each farm is tied to its own licensed tonnage.
As we know, not all of them adhere to such licensing requirements, but that's for another day, perhaps, Paddy. What are the implications of your study, and what should they be?
Yeah, I think the implications are that people are going to have to now reconsider the effect of lice, being high. That in an ideal world, if lice were adequately treated while smolts were going to sea, we may not see many problems. But with increasing temperatures in the spring, and there's as I said, there's a resistance to the chemical that's mainly used by the lice. There's things called treatment failures and all that now, where the lice don't get treated the way they should. So I think the policy implications are that we now have hard evidence that inadequately controlled lice on salmon farms can affect salmon, and the further implication there is that we have 12 rivers entering bays in the west of Ireland where salmon are a qualifying interest in various SACs, and one of the qualifying interests for salmon is in an SAC is that they don't experience any increased mortality from sea lice. So we've now demonstrated that in certain circumstances, in certain bays, depending on lice levels, salmon can get impacted. And that has implications for the SACs, where salmon are a protected species under the Habitats Directive. So you would hope that that this will be looked at more seriously. And if you're undertaking an action that is impacting on a protected species, then what you would hope is that the precautionary principle would apply, and that if it can be demonstrated that an action like operating a salmon farm is impacting or potentially impacting, then uh, you would hope that the precautionary principle would be considered at that stage.
I find that precautionary principle fascinating. I wasn't aware of it. It's from the EU level, Paddy, and it's basically about risk management, isn't it? And
Yeah,
from my understanding of it, is that even if there's not complete scientific consensus, you still have to put the onus on the environment and conservation. Is that right?
yeah, that's true. If there's likely to be harm caused to the environment, and if there is no scientific agreement, then the policy or the action should not be carried out. But they would then probably review it when more scientific information becomes available. So um, one would hope that this new paper will invoke more precaution, and at least set out that that lice from salmon farms can potentially be a significant impact, and that needs to be considered.
It strikes me, Paddy, that anybody who tries to defend or lessen the impact of sea lice on salmon mortality, I compare them to climate change deniers, flat earthers. You have all this, on one hand, you've got all this massive, massive and increasing body of work, scientific work, that is pointing in that direction in terms of the high mortality rate of sea lice on salmon. And you've only got maybe a sliver of papers. And yet it seems to suit, up to now, government bodies to listen to the flat earthers, as I would call them, in the face of all this scientific evidence. Surely, as this scientific evidence grows and grows, and as your paper has been called a landmark study, surely the pressure will have to increase on government bodies that they will actually have to start taking notice.
Yeah, you would hope so. Yeah, and I think bodies like Salmon Watch Ireland, who have been very um, progressive on this issue of trying to protect conserve salmon, will certainly be pushing for more precaution to be taken as a result of the study, and I know that they have been pursuing a number of cases, and I think this will certainly bring forward the scientific evidence to a greater degree.
Just on that, in terms of the applications for salmon farms, as it's currently standing, can your paper be put into those applications now in terms of kind of opposition to them?
The way it works is that if a farm applies for a renewal, which there's quite a lot going on at the moment,
Mhm.
or for a new farm, then an environmental impact. They changed the name, but an EIS or an EIA, an environmental impact assessment, needs to be carried out, and the best scientific information available needs to be considered in there, and a conclusion reached as to whether the application will have an effect on protected habitats and species. So it's up to the applicant to get an EIA prepared for their application and consider all of the relevant literature uh, pertaining to the environment.
And your study is out there now, so it's part of that. It's out in the public domain, so therefore the onus is on them to also take that on board.
Yes.
I've one final question for you, Paddy, in relation to that. The study was in Ireland. Is it
Yeah.
applicable is it applicable then to internationally?
Yeah, it is, I think, because we have a very small industry compared to places like Norway and even Scotland. But I was involved in other publications in 2016, which reviewed everything that was published up to that point, and the Norwegians would have come to the same conclusion. Absolutely, Eva Thorstad's paper from 2016 would have reviewed this whole subject in a much broader way, and come to the same conclusions. So, yeah, it does have implications, I think, because if you can show effects on small production, and small tonnage of farm salmon in Ireland relative to other places, there's a lot of scientific research in Norway, for instance, showing clear evidence of impacts from lice. So this is just another support to. I mean, what we say in the paper is there's an organization called NASCO, the North Atlantic Salmon Conservation Organization, and the paper excuse me, I'll just read this. The paper emphasizes the need to have effective sea lice management such that there is no increase in lice-induced mortality of wild salmonids based on the international goals of NASCO. So what we're looking for is to have no increased mortality of salmon due to sea lice. And whatever way that can be achieved, whether that's more effective lice management, following the cages in the spring, moving them, whatever strategy is best. We have, under the policy implications, we have asked that the NASCO international goals to have effective sea lice management, so there is no increase in lice-induced mortality, that occur.
Let's hope your paper the study is one more big arrow in the quiver. I don't know what more shot across the bow that finally they'll sit up and listen, or just it's one more to add to the weight. Maybe it'll be the straw that breaks the camel's back, hopefully, because the scientific proof is conclusive, and the more pressure that can be put on government bodies, not just in Ireland but around the world. This is just your work is invaluable, Paddy. So all we can say is thank you for the work that you've done. If people want to check out the paper, where could they go? Maybe Salmon Ireland, I think, has a link to it.
They have a link to it. Yeah, I think you have to pay a small amount to the journal to download it, but okay. Salmon Ireland have the link. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, listen, Paddy, thanks again for joining us, and keep up the brilliant work. And just hopefully people will start listening.
Okay, thanks a lot.
And let's hear now from John Murphy of Salmon Watch Ireland, who's just back from the NASCO conference. NASCO is the North Atlantic Salmon Conservation Organisation, which is the only intergovernmental body with the remit to protect Atlantic salmon, and it brings together countries to work on conserving, restoring and managing wild Atlantic salmon.
We sort of knew before we went out there that, at least in Ireland and in our nearest neighbours in the UK, we were suffering catastrophic decline, especially this spring, but over the last decade, you can be sure there are more. But what we were faced with in NASCO, basically, the salmon in the southern limit of their distribution, that means basically Ireland, UK, southern Norway, central Norway, anything down from there, anything down into central Canada, into the US, all those stocks are in crisis. And it's an accelerating crisis, and particularly so in the last 2 to 3 years. More northern climes, like the very north of Newfoundland, up into Russia, the very north of Norway, stocks are holding up.
Just about.
But just about, well, they are holding up reasonably well in those areas. But in Norway as a whole, I think the statistic was given there that over 200 rivers closed as of last year because they were not meeting their conservation limits. So it's a kind of a broad scale collapse.
And would you use that word, collapse?
Well, obviously down here it is.
It's funny that you're not... I can understand people are kind of wary of using such stark language, but because you're not really... It's more tentative going, oh, well, the spring wasn't great now, let's hope for a better grilse run.
Well, yeah, but the grilse are not the most important thing. The most important fish really for... the rivers that have multi-sea winter salmon are the multi-sea winter salmon. Obviously, they carry a lot more eggs. They're bigger fish, obviously. They would produce much more progeny.
Multi-spawners.
Yeah, well, some of them are multi-spawners, but it's just their sheer size, 8 to 12, 14, 15 pounds. They carry a lot of eggs and should be protected. Unfortunately, this year and last year, I've seen a really, really stark decline, and that's mirrored in England, Wales, and Scotland. Some of the people I was sitting with would be from the southwest of England, and especially in and around the Wye and Severn and places like that. Like the total rod catches on the Wye this year are below 20 fish. No, that's stark.
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to think of the, because I remember the numbers from the Y were staggering back in the day.
Well, back in the day, they would have had up to 4,000 to 5,000 fish, and most of those, or a lot of them, certainly would have been caught in the spring. But there just are no fish now. They have other problems, which we're beginning to experience now with poor water quality. But they would have had dire water quality all along in the last decade because of mostly to do with chicken farms, believe it or not. But that seems to be a small bit of an improvement there, that they are doing some work on that. But their salmon numbers have just basically collapsed. And along with it, the interest in salmon fishing has also collapsed.
Just on Scotland, John, because I'm just conscious of Scotland, like this, it's such an industry up there in terms of, the fisheries, the lodges, the money, the history behind it. It's a real identity for Scotland, even more so than Ireland, I'd argue. They must be just at wit's end with the situation.
Well, they are. And speaking to them in NASCO, I mean, they're very, very attached to their salmon, probably more so than we are. Like, it's a big commercial business in Scotland. That is effectively failing in the spring, unless they get big runs of salmon in the summer. Like here, the autumn run in those rivers has effectively been extinguished. Like here, of course, they have a huge issue on their west coast with salmon farms, and there's virtually no fishing on the west coast for salmon now. The east coast rivers are failing badly as well. All you have to do is ask them about the D and the Tay and various things like that, and they'll just tell you, in comparison to even recent history, they're down in their boots. And that's a terrible situation for them. And it's a terrible situation commercially for them because, it's Gillies jobs, estate managers, various things like that are, they're all going to be hit eventually.
Yeah, because the interest will wane. I mean, you touched on it there earlier on. It does. I mean, it's only natural that will happen.
There are very few, private fisheries in this country, but some of those are they're really struggling now. Some of the bigger fisheries on the Munster Blackwater, various things like that. Their catches of spring fish this year have been exceedingly poor.
As part of the conference, there's a thing called the stressors report, is it? So talk to us about that. And
well, basically, each country was asked to basically look at the stressors that were affecting salmon. Basically, I'm just going back here now. Basically across the EU, like obviously at NASCO, EU is the delegation that represents Ireland, but each of the countries had an input into the stressor analysis. The Irish one covered all our 142 salmon rivers. The analysis is carried out by Inland Fisheries Ireland and TEGUS, which is the technical expert group on salmon. The 7 regional basins were examined, and basically, along with all the EU countries, bar none, the highest scoring stressors and the greatest concern was North Atlantic Ocean change. It was the highest overall stressor in all the EU countries and in a lot of the Nordic countries and other countries. Because all Irish salmon certainly are exposed to changing marine conditions, impacting marine survival. There's high uncertainty and poor knowledge of mechanisms. So, in other words, they don't really know whether it's to do with weather patterns, whether it's to do with ocean temperature, whether it's to do with a declining plankton assemblage. It's so complex. and it can work, a year in advance before the fish go out to sea as juveniles. So really is a sort of if you're looking into a Pandora's box, you don't really know what's happening. But I think really, if you look at it, from the layman's point of view, temperatures in the Norwegian Sea have risen alarmingly, and especially in the last 2 to 3 years. So that really can't be good for salmon. Salmon, after all, are a cold water fish. They're an Arctic fish, really. So, I mean, if you're going to get warmer water where they're feeding, and secondly, I think there have been a number of studies done there which have looked at the plankton, the zooplankton that's there, and the ecosystem up there, and it has radically changed from when salmon were abundant in Ireland and Britain. So obviously it has something to do with it. The second stressor that was identified, and this was identified nearly through all EU countries again, was pollution and water quality deterioration. There's obviously, everybody knows, there's widespread nutrient, sediment, silt, and chemical pollution in our rivers. The main sources, obviously, are agriculture. There's a wastewater system in this country which is radically out of date. Urban runoff. All these things affect growth and survival and the habitat quality. Also, along with that, the third stressor that was identified was habitat degradation. That's channelization of rivers through drainage, bank encroachment, widespread habitat quality loss, which affects spawning and resilience of the system to support salmon. And obviously, in the top four stressors is aquaculture. And we all know about that, the marine open net aquaculture along the western seaboard, sea lice, escapes, disease risk, you name it, they're there. There's a lack of effective mitigation or future plans that contributed to the high score. Nobody knows where that industry is going. It's kind of up in the air. There seems to be a big reluctance to get it out of the sea, and a big reluctance on government's part to even incentivize moving those people onto land. So they were the top four stressors, but there were other ones like barriers, water regulation, climate change in freshwater is becoming a big issue. Obviously, you can't have 5 weeks or 6 weeks of sunshine in April and May.
Yeah.
Delaying smolt migration, increasing predation, you name it, that happens. Certainly higher water temperatures in freshwater are certainly going to affect the growth of your young salmon. And, there's going to be more disease, there's going to be more parasites, predators. Okay, I thought predators might be a little bit up further. In some of the countries, it was up quite high. There's a problem with that because it's variable, and the overall knowledge is kind of lacking on what effect it's having. But I can tell you from my own experience, unless you get plenty of water in the spring, which we don't seem to be getting now, smolts are heavily predated on, especially at bottlenecks like weirs. And that's why it's so important to be removing them or mitigating these weirs, because you don't want thousands upon thousands of smolts held up behind a weir, and we'd say in some of the larger rivers like the Boyne and places like that, because they'd be heavily predated, especially when the water is low.
I'd just go back to the top four, like a couple of comments, I think. One is, and this has always scared, and we've always mentioned this scares the bejesus out of me, is the fact that we don't know when it comes to the climate change in the oceans. There's so much we don't know. And that we're because the fact that we don't know and we can't pinpoint it, it makes it even harder to go after, because we don't even know where to start, it seems.
Well, there's two issues here. Obviously, there isn't really enough research goes on in regard to salmon at sea. There were a number of large-scale programs carried out years and years ago, which did identify various issues with bycatch and various things like that. But at the time, it wasn't thought to be significant. Unfortunately, climate change has two two things to it, as far as I can see, and it's from my own personal viewpoint. Obviously, if the temperature of the water is a little bit higher or a lot higher, like 1 degree in the ocean is an awful amount of rise in temperature. Obviously, if that affects the ecosystem, you're certainly going to affect the fish, and you're going to affect their feeding, and you're going to affect the productivity of that area. But also, if these seas are warming in this manner and they're being invaded by warmer water fish like mackerel, like various other pelagic stocks, of course you're going to have the knock-on effect then of pelagic fleets targeting them. And you see, like, I suppose the amount of mackerel being caught in the Norwegian Sea and areas where the salmon feed is probably an awful lot more than were caught there maybe 30 years ago, because their distribution really didn't go that far in those numbers. But I was speaking to a lady there from Greenland, and she basically told me they now have mackerel in Greenland. They had never seen them before. So that's a sign of a changing ocean, and that's a sign, that maybe we should be worried about it a little bit more than we are.
Speaking to somebody from the east coast of Canada, and they were saying around, I forget the name of the bay, but basically the striper bass.
Yeah.
There's like now
we had a discussion about that.
And the influx and the invasion of them. The numbers of the striper bass now is now causing a potential collapse in terms of the salmon on that side, because
I think that's is it in the Miramichi River?
Miramichi, yeah.
And the estuary is there where it goes out into the ocean.
And is that a problem? Is that a problem with predation by the striper bass?
Yeah, that's a huge problem with predation, but that's probably caused by climate change.
Yeah, because they're going.
They're moving further up the east coast.
Yeah, and these fish basically have found some niche that they think is very suitable for them, and there's a ready supply, and I think they spawn sometime around when the smolts are going to sea. So I think they're spawning down in these estuaries, and the smolts have to run that gauntlet.
Unintended consequences, I guess.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But I mean, that's just one instance. I'm sure there are other instances that you could suggest even around the Irish coast. Like, I mean, we all know that angling around the Irish coast, certainly deep sea angling has really gone down and down and down, while bass now are fairly prolific along the south coast here and the southwest coast, more prolific than they have been ever. And I think bass would be quite willing to intercept large numbers of smolts if they could as well. So, I mean, that could be another function that's happening.
And the other thing as well is overfishing, bottom trawling. What's going on there? That's
overfishing. Yeah, I did note on the news, I think it was last night or the night before, the Taoiseach was on from France. They were at this ocean conference, and he did mention the overfishing of sprat in Ireland, and that they were preparing legislation, or had it prepared.
And actually, was that off the back of the whale story? I saw that there was the whale watchers in Cork had closed down because there's just no more whales because there's no sprat.
That's what they're claiming, and I'm sure they're correct in some manner or means. But like, I live right on Kenmare Bay, and it's an absolute disgraceful situation here that we have. I think last year we had 8 very, very large scale trawlers in the bay here. Now, that obviously upsets the ecosystem here and the vast catches of sprat. And I think one of the comments that was made last night on the news was by the Taoiseach, and I think he said something along the lines that, they're only catching these sprat to feed the salmon farms.
Yeah.
Which I was delighted to hear.
That actually, to come from a Taoiseach, that I didn't hear that. That is interesting.
Yeah, but don't quote me on it.
Let's put the Taoiseach on it. Well, if he didn't say it, he should be saying it, John.
Well, I don't have dog privilege.
But isn't that? But like, okay, this again, just you tear your hair at it. So on the one hand, they're pushing salmon farms, and then the next they're saying they'll introduce legislation to save the sprat. Like, it's a bit of both. Sorry, the one other point about just that stressors report, I'm really surprised that aquaculture and salmon farms are only number 4.
Yeah, because I suppose the way you look at that, right? The number one in all probability is the sea. And it really has to be if you look at all the signs. Um, the effect of aquaculture is quite local and quite regional, but um, why is it below the other ones? I'm not too sure. I suppose it's the fact that, you know, it probably doesn't affect the East Coast rivers unless we're going to have an international context to sea lice issues going up past Shetland and various places like that. Do we know that salmon are not being affected up there? I suppose the reason is that maybe it's, well, I won't say it's confined to certain areas on the West Coast. It's nearly all over the West Coast. But it probably wouldn't be affecting salmon from the Munster Blackwater or Shore nor various rivers like that. So I suppose the other stressors are probably, I won't say more important, but they're probably more wide scale.
And would it be also as well? I don't know how to say this. I say they're more visible. Do you get what I
Yeah,
mean?
but
I mean, we can't, and well, we will touch that hopefully with the research that's come out now, that the scientific research is pointing to the fact that lice problems in aquaculture do affect salmon. But like, we have never been, should we say, given that on a plate served to us that this is true. Now the research is beginning to show this, but heretofore it wasn't, and as we've discussed for reports here, it was played down, and those reports were used by government bodies here to play it down. Whereas, the ocean's warming, we all know about. Water pollution, as you said, within rivers, we all know that. We see that. I mean, you quoted the why there. Of course, they see that. All of the other things are very visible. But maybe at the moment with aquaculture, the only reason it's number four, it's only coming to light now that it is a definite that it is causing a problem. I mean, heretofore with aquaculture in this country, we always assumed it was the sea trout they were affecting.
yeah,
If we look at it,
yeah,
aquaculture was, it decimated the sea trout fishing. Yeah, but
mhm,
we
absolutely.
never really pinpointed it as being, the downfall of salmon. But hopefully now with, yeah, as we said, this paper that's come out with Paddy Gargan, that hopefully we can look at this and that there is scientific research pointing the finger at aquaculture and the lice infestation.
Oh God, yeah. Obviously, it's a great help to us and various other people. But I suppose, if you're being logical about the whole thing, it doesn't explain the massive drop
Mhm.
uh, alone.
Mm.
Okay. There are obviously the other stressors are probably, I won't say more important, but probably the one I sort of look at on the ocean as causing 70% of the problem.
Right.
Uh, but the other things are things that we can sort of have some
Mm.
control over, if not total control over, but we can have certain control over pollution and water quality deterioration. A lot of those, I was attending remotely the EPA conference today, and there is some very, very good work going on there in regard to trying to stave off various interest groups like agriculture and various things like that that are, you know, don't seem to have an affinity with good water quality. And, that's kind of government policy, but that's where science comes into it. And that's where the Habitats Directive and Water Framework Directive are at their strongest because they kind of have to do certain things. They might be unpopular, but they probably have to do certain things. Habitat degradation is ongoing everywhere. You're always, listening and seeing reports of people digging out streams and straightening rivers, and some of it government led, unfortunately. But a lot of it, I always said that the one big enemy of the countryside was when they got mechanized diggers that could go anywhere, that could do they could do in a week what you couldn't do in 10 years
Mm.
before that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the reality. But I suppose agriculture, okay, a huge problem in the west of Ireland and a huge problem down here. we probably wouldn't have the pollution and water quality deterioration. We wouldn't have the habitat degradation either. So I suppose our two top stressors here would be the ocean, obviously, and aquaculture would be the second one that's going on here.
Yeah, let's just tease that out, John. We spoke to Paddy Gargan and we heard from Paddy Gargan there earlier on the show. And Paddy obviously we spoke to him about the paper landmark study is I think the phrase used for it. 20 years of data that basically showed incontrovertibly, really, that sea lice increases mortality of salmon. So, Paddy, explain to us the implications of this. So I presume Salmon Watch Ireland are going to take this up, especially in relation to the ongoing applications at the moment of salmon farms.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we're obviously in the process of making submissions at the moment. There are a number of farms up for renewal at the moment. There's only two. I think there's some up in the west of Ireland out to public consultation on the newspaper. They haven't appeared on the website yet. We will be making submissions and using that data. One of the issues with those renewals is that all those EISs and environmental reports are written probably obviously prior to this publication, but obviously prior to the court case in Bantry Bay as well. We certainly will be using that data and the findings from that report. It's great, really, because all you have to do, especially for areas near salmon SACs, is introduce doubt. Because appropriate assessment, they have to work within the precautionary principle. So there has to be an absence of scientific doubt. So I don't know whether anyone will contest these findings. I doubt it. I doubt if the Marine Institute contest them either.
But surely they have to stop citing, and the government has to stop citing this Jackson paper now.
Well, you see, they're probably not citing it directly. It's the developers and the people applying for the farms.
I heard quotes from Charlie McConalogue as Minister for Ag back in
the of course,
and they don't cite it, but they say, well, scientific research has shown, so.
Yeah. Well, you see, that's all very fine until you get into a court case. And basically it'll be up in front of a judge and we'll be asking them to listen to our expert witness. And if they want to bring somebody else in and say, no, this is all wrong, that's fine. We'll win out because we think we'll win out because we've introduced doubt. And the data is very, very good from this recent paper. So we'd be very, very, happy to see a court case in the near future.
That's really interesting, actually, Johnny, because I hadn't thought of it that way. Because obviously, you'd have so little faith in the government and politicians to do the right thing.
Well, they probably won't. They'll probably give out these licenses, and then it will enter into a situation where we'll be entering judicial reviews, and that takes time. The only thing now is this legislation, which allowed them to continue, is supposed to be taken out of legislation. So they've been a little bit reluctant to do that in a hurry because they'd have no legal standing then. If they were refused, that's the end of it.
Interesting.
They couldn't continue. That's what I'm trying to say to you.
Yeah.
But they're slippery customers.
So really, it will take the courts to actually set a precedent here, and off the basis of courts' decisions, and like you said, it
would take a court to set a precedent. But I mean, the department, unless they're hell bent on trying to get these things through, like you have a situation there in Donegal Bay, especially where you have certain farms that are operating. There are huge mortalities on them. Secondly, all the rivers up there, or a lot of the rivers up there, are at very, very low levels of their conservation limit. So, I mean, this data now should really say, look, can't be licensing this. This is a protected species in an SAC. Sorry, you can't do this. So I really think, we're onto a winner there. There wouldn't be. There's been lots of things stopped because of High Court judgments. Once they're found to be in breach of European laws and Habitats Directive, like the Bantry Bay case, the Water Framework Directive, just can't give them a license then.
Okay.
Unless they go to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it's ongoing. Like,
They'd be well able to finance that, wouldn't they? And it can go on and on and on.
It could be. I mean, it'd be the government we'd be suing.
Would it be the government? Oh, it'd be the government.
Yeah, we wouldn't be. Well, we wouldn't be going after the fish farmers themselves, because you see, a judicial review is a judicial review of a decision made by a minister. I'll tell you now, there was an awful lot of international interest in the Bantry Bay case.
really?
And we've been in consultation with people in Iceland, and this NASCO conference now, we've great interest from Norwegians and the Icelandics, obviously, and Sami people from Finland, who are very, very interested. I think there's a kind of a proposal to move salmon farming up into the very north of Norway, in around where the Sami people have their own self-regulating government, and they don't want it. But they were very, very interested in that case. So we're directly liaising with them. We've given them all the judgments. Iceland, believe it or not, is a country which is subject to European directives. Norway isn't, but they have their own laws to protect nature. So that court judgment in Dublin could have an effect. They were very interested from the point of view of the Water Framework Directive and pollution, because they have huge problems in Norway with pollution of salmon farms.
Just for the benefit of people who might be aware of it, could you just give us a quick go over the Bantry Bay case?
Well, the Bantry Bay case was, obviously it was a long time in the making. I think it took about 8 years or 10 years for them to get the license. They got the license. It was judicially reviewed, it was appealed to the Aquaculture License Appeal Board, who took a long, long time to make up their mind. And basically, when they did and gave the license, we took a judicial review. And the judge quashed the license on a number of grounds. The first ground was on the Water Framework Directive, on the pollution of Bantry Bay, or basically Bantry Bay is a high quality water body. And the judgment basically said, well, you can't exceed the amount of nitrogen you were going to put out, even for one day, which was fairly good. The other aspect of it was to do with the cage design and structure, which wasn't properly formulated or examined in the environmental impact assessment. So that was thrown out. The license which allows the aquaculture facility to exist in Bantry Bay, a foreshore license, that was applied for 12 cages, I think, but there were to be 18 cages in the new farm. And they never did anything to update the foreshore license. They thought it would just drift by, but it didn't. And the judge said, no, you can't do that either. So that was a great win for everybody involved, including Inland Fisheries Ireland and Mr. Sweetman. So, it has gained a bit of international traction now, and they're looking at that judgment seriously to see if it could relate to certain farms in Norway or whatever. The situation in Norway is dire. There's just too many farms. It's ridiculous.
And I did an interview with the Norwegian Minister for the Environment back at the Wild Salmon Summit in January in London, and I would not be holding high hope for change to be introduced in Norway based on the interview with him.
No, well, it's a huge industry.
It's
massive.
It's their oil.
But it is. Well, they have oil.
Yeah, but they see that they know oil is going down. They know oil is decreasing, and they see only salmon farms increasing. Isn't it?
I know.
They want to treble.
But I mean, come back to salmon farms now. I mean, there's a marine heat wave here now. Maybe the weather's cooled down a bit now, but I mean, the temperature around here is 2 to 3 degrees higher than normal. Now, there probably will be large-scale mortalities this year in the salmon sector. It's just not the place to be farming.
Yeah, salmon. You would hope it becomes unproductive for them, isn't it? That they feck off somewhere else.
Well, economically unproductive. Yeah, and as well as that, like I mean, through the work of NGOs and various other people, like haven't been able to get their hands on new license. They haven't been able to expand the industry. They tried to expand it in Bantry Bay, and that failed. I think there's one other new one in the pipeline, but the rest of them are renewals.
Right.
And if we can get a decision in the court to basically say no,
That could be the start.
I think we could, we could get rid of them in a lot of areas. Probably not in every area, but anything near a salmon site, an SAC. I mean, I think that's fair game for us.
Yeah, you just
fair game for people in the NGO sector.
you want it so it's not worth their while. They go, oh, feck that. I'm not going through that with the fellas over there in Ireland. It's just not worth it. We don't make enough money. It's too much hassle.
Well, they don't make any money. That's the reality in 2023 anyway. They probably made a bit of money last year, but I think actually no, it's costing them money here.
Yeah.
And you just can't imagine why an international company like that would be even operating here, like Maui. Of course, we some local operators as well. So I don't know. Maybe they're not. Maybe they've an endless supply of money. I'm not too sure.
It's so. What came out of the NASCO conference, John? Is it like basically you agree on something and you agree next steps? What came out of it like?
Well, there's a kind of a strategic vision for the next 10 years. We wanted them to basically up their view as such. I think the strategic vision was to slow the decline and prove that restoration was possible. I think we wanted them to go a little bit further than that, but that's kind of, somebody described it as kind of semantics, but really not. They really should be trying to halt the decline. It's difficult because there are various governments involved there that have other issues, especially with aquaculture, like the Norwegians, and even though I think they were leaning more towards the wild fish. But you have Canada, various other places like that. Not the NGOs now, I'm talking about the government departments that would have, certain other interests. And it's probably difficult to get things by them. But there are two studies coming out. I think Paddy Gargan was involved in one, was the leading one of them actually, to do with sea lice and to do with introgression. And I think they were financed by NASCO and the European Union. There wouldn't be NASCO scientific papers, but there probably will be accepted by the parties at next year's conference. But they're not completed as of yet or not published. But I'd say they will be fairly dramatic.
It's interesting. We're getting more research and more studies and more proof. But you wonder, geez, is it going to be too late?
I'm not too sure. I think this could be all futile if it's a climate-driven thing. I mean, I don't think that's going to reverse too quickly. Yeah. You may get odd years that there could be relatively good stocks of salmon. But I mean, saying that, in the newsletter today, we just basically asked people, look, you don't have to be made to do the right thing. I'm talking now to basically the angling community, and I would talk to the commercial community if we could get to them. You don't have to be made to do the right thing. You can do the right thing voluntarily, and we probably need most of the salmon from now on to be left in the rivers.
The gifts.
Yeah.
And it is fairly dire, and there's an absence of spring fish, absence of big fish. Maybe a lot of fish will come now, but maybe they're not the ones we really want. We probably want a lot more of the, multi-sea winter females or whatever. But look, a lot of salmon could turn up in the next couple of weeks, or none could turn up. My bet is on probably somewhere in between. I don't think it's going to be great. You're in Galway, aren't you?
Tom, is it?
I'm in Galway, yeah.
Tom. Yeah, I would expect that the weir is not very good, is it?
No.
No.
I mean, it's still throughout the West Coast, there's absolutely nothing happening. It's
Yeah.
the middle of June now.
Yeah, we're getting the same reports now from the Owenmore, Owen Duff. Or Blackwater is kind of disastrous. My own system here in Waterville is atrocious. I don't know where we're going from here. If the fish are not there, I mean, really probably shouldn't be getting anything, but certainly the larger fish should be left alone.
Well, what I would say, John, is for people to keep informed. And I think especially for the salmon angling community, I find your newsletter, the Salmon Watch Ireland newsletter, invaluable. So I'd recommend people go to salmonwatchireland.ie where they can sign up to receive it. Every month, it's just, I find it a brilliant source of information for what's happening, court cases, new information. So honestly, just anybody who's any interest in salmon.
Yeah, and I'm always suggesting that if anybody wants anything researched or whatever, we have some research capability, not much, but and legal capabilities. So I mean, it's given out to people. Like, all we ask is maybe that they join. But we have helped some issues along the way, probably in a more covert way than would be expected. We don't want to be blowing trumpets about things, but we do try and help people that come to us. And, we do intercede with Inland Fisheries Ireland. And, you have to work with regulatory bodies because you're just not going to get anywhere on your own. But, people, if they want something done, they should contact us or ask us. And, we're more than willing to advise them one way or the other. They mightn't like our advice.
But look, even just to keep yourself informed, and even, consider joining as well. It's well worthwhile. John, I have a funny feeling we're going to be chatting again before the season ends, just to keep us posted on any news that is happening, especially in relation to the salmon farm licenses.
I did say there, one last point. I did say there, I believe there is to be a policy statement by the Board of Inland Fisheries Ireland in the next number of weeks.
Interesting.
So we expect, we don't know what's in it, but we'd hope it'll be, will protect salmon in some manner or means. And that's probably, you remember the webinar that was on? And that probably was the precursor to that. And people were asked for their views, so said there's going to be some changes. And there probably needs to be, in fact, there does need to be some changes.
Yeah, well, I think that's blatantly obvious for anyone with a pair of eyes and a pair of ears.
Yes, absolutely.
John, keep up the great work, and look, we'll keep in touch anyway as the fight goes on. Thanks a million for joining us.
Understand.
Our thanks to Paddy and our thanks to John for joining us on the show. And don't forget to rate, review and follow the Ireland on the Fly podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from.
Plus, you can keep up to date on IrelandOnTheFly.com as well as on Instagram, and myself and Tom will be back with another episode about the people and places of fly fishing in Ireland.